very interesting debate about the role of women in this positive economy. Now let's talk about other things. We're always talking about speed, about being fast, but should we always try and be fast and think about the short term? This is what Antoine Frérot, CEO of Veolia, is going to tell us about. He's going to tell us about the dictatorship of short-termism. Good evening, Mr. Frérot. The floor is yours. Are we submitted to the dictatorship of short term? Well, good evening. No, it's a big question. But the dictatorship of the clock is not too much of a constraint here on this forum. That's a good start. So, the reign of urgency, impatience, the demands of immediacy are a characteristic of our modern societies, and they sometimes enslave our collective life and even our individual lives. Okay, we can all be sorry about this, but being sorry doesn't make it less true. And being sorry doesn't point to any solution to the dictatorship of short term. It's present in all spheres in our lives. A few examples in the economy to start with. Needs to have a very short-term, immediate financial return without taking much risk, rather than having enough margin of maneuver to build a sustainable and profitable economic activity. But not just in the economy, in the media, with immediate information that prevents us from taking the time for analyzing, reflecting, and understanding the facts. In technologies with obsolescence and speedy renewal of product rather than making durable products which can be repaired. And in the political sphere, with the stacking up of priorities, and therefore all leaders are turned into firemen rather than architects. Short term means you have to take care of what's immediate, what already exists, at the expense of what does not exist yet. It reduces the impact of imagination and constrains the field of possibilities. It does not help building the future, but it also damages our abilities to adapt and to react promptly to the unforeseen or the unavoidable. Therefore, it hinders both creativity and agility, and more largely speaking, the taking of risk or taking of initiatives. And it prevents the world from monitoring or from controlling its pathway. So this focus on short term is very similar to other distortions in other spheres. Just a few examples. The first one being the increase and concentration of strongholds in the hands of a few players as compared to other stakeholders in a company. Another example, the triumph of individuality in our modern societies as compared to collective interest and as opposed to rational altruism. So, to be concise, to me, everything for me right now, that's the dictatorship of short term. We can't tell which distorted space leads to the distortion of the others. Does it start with the distortion of time, space, of society? And there are so many interactions between these spheres that everything must be interdependent and simultaneous. Hence the idea that if some approaches were implemented to improve certain of these spaces, it could help improve the others, i.e., better taking into account long term could bring more harmony in the relationships between stakeholders, or could help take collective interest more into account. So what could be these approaches to better balance short-term imperatives that do exist, and we can't deny that, and long-term concerns? A workshop chaired by Jacques Attali started working on such approaches, and we published a book called For a Positive Economy. This report also has relationship with the very existence of this forum today. Let me talk about three of these approaches, which I think are the most emblematic ones. The first one would be use the law to take into account the interest of future generations. The second would be reward better long-term thinkers. And the third would be create better harmony to satisfy the interest of all stakeholders in companies. So first, taking into account the interest of future generations. So that means defining the duties of current generations, using the law to do that. In this interdependent world, we need to do that through international law. That's a big endeavor indeed. But just to take a few examples in an area I'm very familiar with, it could be including the use of the most fragile and rarest natural resources, or extending the principle of who pollutes space to all types of pollutions. We can talk about this with the pollution of the oceans. We can talk about this, about the use of fossil fuels. All this to take into account the interest of future generations in order to regulate the actions of current generations. Second example, reward the long term. So we need to give a value, whether symbolic or financial value, to those actions that prepare and improve long term. One example in a sphere which is very familiar to me, but which you can apply to spheres which are very familiar to you. In the economy, more remuneration for long-term investors in a company in order to encourage patient, loyal, and reasonable capitalism. Or better conditions for clients who make a long-term commitment with their suppliers so that they can better anticipate their development. In the field of the environment, we can think of financially encouraging products from circular economy and from recycling. In a newspaper today, someone was talking about a different VAT for recycled products as compared to other types of products. This would help saving on resources. Another example in the field of governance, implement and impose the use of metrics to assess the performance of organizations that would take into account the consequences of their actions on the long term. So the report I talked about was offering two types of indicators for corporations and for countries to measure these performances and measure the evolution of long-term performances. And third type of approach, which has to do with corporations, because the different stakeholders, clients, suppliers, employees, territories, NGOs, clients, and future generations, because a large corporation works for many generations, these stakeholders work with the company to satisfy interests they would not be able to achieve without cooperating together. And the good health and survival of companies means that all these stakeholders need to find what they came to the company to find. But the components are not all working at the same pace. And if corporations don't take care of it, those who are the most powerful impose their momentum on the others. So corporate governance needs to make sure that there is a right balance in the decision-making process in order to satisfy all its stakeholders, which it needs. And there again, our report was coming up with proposals. In conclusion, time is the great art of humans, as Napoleon said, but it's a difficult art. Articulating long-term and short-term means adopting a field of vision which we're no longer familiar with. And this is probably one of the most difficult and most significant mission of any organization and any business leader. But furthermore, being capable of seeing from up close and from afar is the ambition and life of any human beings. And a company is life. Any organization is life. So in order not to stumble by just looking on the long term and to avoid bumping in walls by looking just at the short term, we need to be able to do both at the same time. Thank you. Thank you, Antoine Frérot. Thank you for this presentation about the dictatorship of short term. And Jean-Louis Servan-Schreiber, a few years back, had written a very good